The tension in the Middle East had been building for months, but on that night, the silence finally shattered. Over the skyline of Tehran, military alarms echoed through command centers as Iranian defense officials tracked unusual activity across regional radar systems. Satellites had detected aircraft movements, naval formations, and electronic signals that suggested something massive was about to unfold. Inside underground military bunkers, senior commanders gathered around glowing digital maps that displayed the entire Middle East like a giant chessboard. Only hours earlier, reports had circulated that U.S. and Allied forces were repositioning across the region. Aircraft carriers were moving closer to the Persian Gulf, and advanced aircraft had begun arriving at several American bases. Though such deployments were not unusual, the scale of this buildup was different. Intelligence analysts in Tehran believed it was preparation for a wider operation. Then, just before midnight, Iranian surveillance systems detected missile launches and stealth aircraft moving towards strategic targets. Explosions soon followed across multiple military installations and defense facilities. The blasts shook buildings and lit up the night sky, sending shock waves across nearby districts. Iranian state television quickly interrupted regular broadcasts, announcing that the country was under attack and that emergency defensive measures had been activated. Within minutes, Iran's military command authorized a large-scale retaliation plan that had been prepared for years. Missile batteries and drone units across the country received encrypted launch codes. Operators moved swiftly through rehearsed procedures, fueling missiles and activating guidance systems. The order was clear: respond immediately and demonstrate that Iran could strike back across the region. As the first missiles roared into the sky, streaks of fire illuminated the darkness above Iran's deserts and mountains. Radar stations tracked their paths as they crossed the Gulf toward American positions. In that moment, what had long been a shadow conflict of threats and warnings transformed into a dangerous new chapter, one that would pull the entire region into a rapidly escalating confrontation. By the time the sun began to rise across the Middle East, the scale of the retaliation was becoming clear. Iranian officials announced that dozens of American military positions across the region had been targeted overnight. Missile launches and long-range drones had been sent toward bases spread across several countries, including installations used by U.S. forces for logistics, intelligence, and air operations. Though many of the incoming weapons were intercepted by air defense systems, the sheer number of launches forced alarms to sound at bases throughout the region. Inside these bases, the night had been chaotic. Radar operators detected waves of fast-moving objects approaching from multiple directions. Warning sirens blared as soldiers rushed to protective shelters while defense systems activated automatically. Interceptor missiles shot upward, colliding with incoming projectiles high in the sky. Bright flashes lit the darkness as explosions echoed across desert landscapes and coastal installations. In several locations, fragments of intercepted missiles fell to the ground, causing small fires and damage around the perimeter of military compounds. Emergency crews moved quickly to secure the areas and assist personnel affected by the blasts. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning for additional threats while security teams locked down the bases. News of the attacks spread rapidly across global media networks. Governments throughout the region began issuing emergency statements, and many countries temporarily closed their airspace as a precaution. Civilian flights were rerouted, and commercial ships in nearby waters adjusted their courses to avoid possible danger zones. Meanwhile, in Tehran, state broadcasters reported that the strikes were a response to earlier attacks and described the operation as a demonstration of Iran's military reach. Images of missile launches were replayed repeatedly on television, while officials warned that any further aggression would trigger additional responses. But even as those statements were broadcast, another development was already underway. Thousands of miles away, in command centers across the United States, military leaders were preparing the next move, one that could reshape the conflict entirely. As the strategic bombers approached the Middle East, the conflict entered a tense and uncertain phase. Military analysts around the world closely monitored every movement, knowing that a single decision could determine whether the crisis expanded further or began to stabilize. Satellites and surveillance aircraft watched the region constantly, tracking missile sites, air defenses, and troop movements across vast stretches of desert and coastline. Inside American command centers, the strategic objective was carefully debated. While the deployment of bombers demonstrated overwhelming military capability, leaders understood that every action carried consequences beyond the battlefield. A large-scale strike could weaken enemy infrastructure, but it could also risk triggering a wider regional war involving multiple countries. Meanwhile, life across parts of the Middle East had already begun to change. In cities near military installations, residents watched the skies nervously as fighter jets roared overhead. News broadcasts ran continuous updates about missile defenses, naval movements, and diplomatic statements from world leaders. Markets fluctuated, shipping routes shifted, and governments increased security around important infrastructure. In Tehran, officials continued to declare that their military had proven its ability to strike distant targets. State media framed the attacks as a show of national strength and resistance. At the same time, Iranian defenses remained on high alert, anticipating the possibility of further retaliation from American forces now positioned within striking distance. Across the region, soldiers on both sides waited through long hours of uncertainty. Radar screens glowed in dark control rooms while commanders studied incoming intelligence reports. Every blip on a screen or signal detected in the sky demanded attention. Whether the conflict would escalate into something far larger or eventually ease through diplomacy remained unknown. What was clear, however, was that the events of those days had already altered the strategic balance of the region. The confrontation had revealed how quickly tensions could transform into open confrontation, reminding the world that modern conflicts unfold not only on battlefields, but across politics, technology, and global security. In Washington, the atmosphere inside military command centers had turned intensely focused. As reports from the Middle East continued to arrive, senior defense officials gathered around large digital displays tracking the overnight attacks. Each incoming update added another layer to the rapidly evolving situation. Intelligence officers analyzed radar data, satellite imagery, and communications intercepts to understand the scale of the Iranian response and assess potential threats to American personnel stationed across the region. The immediate priority was clear: protect U.S. forces and restore strategic control. Within hours of the first missile strikes, new orders were issued across several branches of the military. Air bases in Europe and the United States began preparing long-range aircraft capable of traveling thousands of miles without landing. Strategic bombers, aircraft designed for deep penetration missions and heavy payloads, were placed on high alert. Soon after, these massive aircraft lifted off from their runways, beginning long journeys toward forward bases closer to the Middle East. Their flights were carefully coordinated with aerial refueling tankers that would allow them to remain in the air for extended periods. On radar screens across military monitoring stations, their slow but steady progress was watched closely. Meanwhile, naval forces already stationed in nearby waters were repositioned. Aircraft carriers and accompanying warships adjusted their patrol routes, creating protective zones around key sea lanes and military installations. Fighter jets were launched to maintain continuous patrols over the region, ensuring that any new threat could be detected quickly. Diplomatic channels also became active. Officials from several allied nations held urgent discussions about security and stability in the region. Leaders understood that any further escalation could impact international trade routes, global energy supplies, and the safety of millions of civilians living across the Middle East. As the strategic bombers continued their journey toward the region, the message was unmistakable. The United States was preparing not just to defend its positions, but to demonstrate that it still possessed overwhelming reach and power across the skies.